Hi again, welcome to the second video of our Just War Humanitarian Intervention and Responsibility to Protect series. In the first video, we have explored just war and humanitarian intervention. And now we will start to talk about the responsibility to protect. In the first video, we have defined just war and we have seen the philosophical background of just war thinking as well as its actors. We had an example from history. We also defined what was and what is the humanitarian intervention. We have seen the legal background and political approaches to the concept. We saw the actors of humanitarian intervention with the examples from 90s. And now we will start to talk about responsibility to protect. So when the R2P report was adopted, why and how it was supposed to change some concepts of the international society. We will see the legal background of the responsibility to protect, whether it is a norm, a doctrine, or a principle. We will talk about the political discourse on the R2P and the consistency with the practice. We will understand what are the dilemma inherent to responsibility to protect, who are the actors, and we will talk about the example of Libya. Okay, so let's continue with the responsibility to protect. The report of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty on the responsibility to protect was published in 2001. The adoption of the R2P report at the UN World Summit outcome document in 2005 was a sign for the international society to move forward in becoming a more solidarist one, relying on the cooperation model to bring up new concepts and new rules in the name of protecting civilian human rights against mass atrocity crimes. Why this kind of report was prepared and adopted? The adoption of the R2P report was an instrument served by the members of the Society of States in the new conjuncture of the 2000s, started with the 9/11, and was also a challenge against the supremacy of sovereignty concerns in the minds and acts of the members of the international society. As the paradigms shifted with the end of the Cold War and an adaptation period was needed, unfortunately, 90 successive humanitarian tragedies showed the incapacity to prevent or stop those. So these experiences led the Society of States to find some remedies against them. The International Criminal Court and most notably R2P are born in such an atmosphere, but the shift of the international society for the protection of substantive values has not led to a transformation in the legal procedures that will regulate the way it responds when these values are challenged. So global normative and institutional developments in terms of fighting against mass atrocity crimes exist, but R2P remained in the political sphere, in other terms, in sovereign exclusive areas of the states. So how the responsibility to protect was supposed to change the international society's approach towards the sovereignty concept, towards responsibility concept, towards human rights. The R2P concerns above all the prevention of crises and includes the operations of humanitarian intervention. The responsibility to protect includes a series of actions, namely diplomatic persuasion as well as non-military sanctions through the International Criminal Court. So the report suggested a transformation of whether or not to intervene into how to intervene. With the report, prevention was substituted by reaction. The sovereignty was redefined. So in the R2P report, there is no talking about an immune sovereign, but a responsible sovereign. The report identified the targeted crimes, the genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing are subject to responsibility to protect. The report determined the pillars of the responsibility. There are 3 pillars. The first responsibility is on state to protect its own people. The second responsibility is on the international community to assist the state to fulfill this responsibility. And the third responsibility is again on the international community to fulfill the responsibility itself. If the state is not capable or is unwilling to fulfill its own responsibility, the international community can first fulfill this responsibility through economic or diplomatic sanctions, and it also can decide on waging a military intervention. What is the legal background of the responsibility to protect? Is it a norm, a doctrine, or a principle? I can say all of these and none of them. The adoption of the R2P did not accord the legal status, so the states have not the obligation to take the legal engagement. In other words, the R2P is left to an arbitrary interpretation by each international actor. Nevertheless, the very basis of the reasons behind the adoption of this report was the obligations emanating from the human rights regime that we have talked about in the first video when we are evaluating the legal background of humanitarian intervention. So arguing that the R2P is lacking a legal aspect would not be 100% right, in the sense that it is founded on the basic human rights protection regime already having a legal status. According to Jennifer Welsh, a former UN Secretary General's advisor on the responsibility to protect, there are 3 main problems of the report itself. The first is the fact that the R2P of the international society is designed to be triggered in the case of large scale of loss of life. So in the sense, there was no clarity about the conditions of an international action. A second problem consisted on the source of international responsibility, whether it was derived from international law or morality. Insisting on moral principles, though, in order not to be engaged by binding legal obligations, is an important emphasis. And the third problem consisted of to which entity the responsibility was accorded. So it was the international community in general. It is the UN Security Council who has the competence to authorize the military responsibility. But again, who is the responsible actor? We do not know clearly. So what is the political discourse on the R2P? And is there any consistency between the discourse and the practice? As a matter of fact, the R2P remains as a political commitment rather than a legal obligation. And the SOD represents a form of soft law, as Jennifer Welsh claims. There is no new legal obligation created for states, and it does not create any new international mechanism or authority to undertake executive action. Rather, it presents a new interpretation of existing rules by underlying particular normative understandings about domestic and international conduct. So states are reluctant to get engaged with legally binding rules, but this causes mass violation of human rights all around the world. So the fact that the R2P remains in the political domain results not only in the selectivity of the decision of the international society, but also in its delay and determinacy of its decisions on humanitarian tragedies. So this is why there are dilemmas inherent to responsibility to protect. On the one hand, we have the prevalence of state sovereignty still persisting, the prohibition of recourse to force, the prohibition to intervene in domestic politics. But on the other hand, we have the protection of civilian rights, and there are victims of mass atrocity crimes. And this dilemma cause some problems and some questions, like how to protect the victims of massive human rights violations. Who will decide to protect? When to start to protect? And because of this dilemma, there is a huge skepticism about Western protection in the third world. And this remaining in political domain harm the seriousness and the effectiveness of the implementation of the responsibility to protect. Who are the actors of the responsibility to protect? First of all, we have to talk about the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly. So the UN in general, having the fundamental documents on human rights, gathering state members of international society, having the competence to adopt resolutions with reference to human rights and R2P in order to promote those and help the internalization process of these norms. Even though the efforts are not enough, there are some progress. And the role of the UN Security Council as the only competent body to decide on military intervention is equally important. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, has an important role, of course, for the prosecution of mass atrocity crimes perpetrators. It is even called the body of responsibility to prosecute. But the problem relies on the limited number of states recognizing the Rome Statute. So, for example, the US has not signed the statute. The European Union is important because actually it was a promising role for the promotion of responsibility to protect and to assist the post-conflict reconstruction. But the EU was reluctant to play this role, actually. But we will see that this can change with the war in Ukraine. NATO is an important actor, of course, with the ability to recourse to force against mass atrocity perpetrators, but its competence can only be used with the authorization of the UN Security Council. The African Union, in terms of upholding the norm within the non-Western world and in terms of endorsing the norm within the UN, could be important, but as we have talked about it, the skepticism towards the Western intervention played an important role, and the African Union played an important role in Libya intervention, actually, but then for some reasons that we will talk about later, the skepticism persists. The Global Center for the R2P is doing an amazing work following all mass atrocity crimes seen in the world and calling the international society, making pressure on it to discuss and to go forward for the rights of suffering peoples. It highlights the mass atrocity crimes in different geographies. The protection approaches is playing an important role as a bridge between suffering people, states, and the international society. So is the case study Libya intervention is an important turning point, I can say. The responsibility to protect became concretely visible when the international society decided to intervene in the Libya civil war in 2011. The crisis in Libya was born following the democratic aspirations of Arab Spring started in Tunisia in 2011, followed by the brutal reaction of the Gaddafi regime against protesters. In a timely and decisive way, as was anticipated by the Autopsy report, the UN Security Council adopted two consecutive resolutions, 1970 and 1973, to prevent further atrocities and stop the violence committed by the regime towards Libyan people. By its first resolution, Resolution 1970, Security Council referred the case to the ICC, and the significance of it hinges upon the fact that the international society completed its responsibility to protect by its responsibility to prosecute. The specificity of the Resolution 1973 was due to UN Security Council authorization to recourse to force against Libya, a sovereign government recognized and member of the UN, to protect the civilian population. Here, remarks have to be made on many facilitating elements for the Society of States to adopt those resolutions. At regional level, the Arab League or the African Union support for such an intervention. Libya's particularities, the evidence called by Colonel Gaddafi to mass killings, the negative human rights protection record of the Libya regime, the lack of international alliances of Libya, and the support to terrorism by the regime, rich petrol resources, weak army structures, are all facilitating elements for the international society to go forward. So these promising resolutions were also challenged by the reaction by Russia, particularly by Vladimir Putin, to condemn the abstention of Medvedev during the adoption vote, as well as the reaction of the Arab League and African Union members becoming skeptical about the humanitarian purposes of the intervention after the regime change in the country. The political contestation after the Libya intervention over regime change and the use of protection of civilian mandate is the symptom of a perceived legitimacy deficit in the ordering structure of international society, which also influenced, first of all, Syria crisis, but Myanmar, Rohingya, Yemen crisis, all around the world. Here were the basics on the responsibility to protect. So you can make your comments and ask your questions below. And if you have not seen yet the first video on just war and humanitarian intervention, I recommend you to go to the first video and see the philosophical and legal background of responsibility to protect. Thank you and see you in new videos.